Welcome to the first Excel interview talk of the year. It's my pleasure to introduce Douglas Densmore. Doug is an expert in tools for embedded systems and systems biology and synthetic biology. Doug?
So it's great to talk about how platform-based design can apply to two seemingly disparate areas, those of embedded electronics as well as synthetic biology. And this talk really is two parts. It's going to talk first about how we can do embedded electronics efficiently and accurately, and how we can also make systems for synthetic biology. So setting the stage, what I'm saying is that embedded electronic design is challenging now. And why is it challenging? It's challenging because we're trying to deal with increased complexity. So if you think of a complexity metric perhaps in terms of millions of operations per second, you can see that that's increasing across not only in one application area, but several. In this case, networking, cellular video. So why is it hard to deal with complexity? It's because we're increasingly looking at new levels of parallelism. We're also looking at different timing requirements. Increasingly, things need to work faster and faster. And of course, Moore's law gives us more and more silicon resources to do things. So you can deal with complexity by raising the level of abstraction in the system. So instead of thinking about lower level details, you decide which you can abstract away and then think more of a system level design. You can think about only what is important. The other issue is heterogeneity. So this is an automotive system, and the idea is not to read all of this, but to understand that in an automotive system today, we have lots of different components, and not only are the components different, but the communication systems are different as well. So why is this difficult? This is difficult because we have different models of computation across in this system. We also have different timing domains. An automobile, for example, has many hard real-time requirements. And one way to deal with this is we need modularity. So modularity is going to allow us to individually isolate these components or communication subsystems and test them, reuse them, and also prove properties about them. And then if you take this environment as a whole, complexity and heterogeneity are difficult because they're kind of pushing up against time to market requirements. You know, because systems are more complex and more heterogeneous, it's often difficult to release things at the same schedule we would have maybe a couple of generations ago. And so what we need in simulation or design frameworks are to be accurate and to be efficient. That will prevent these large design loops and often help you meet these kind of goals in this current framework. So just to get right off the bat, I want to clearly state what the objective of this talk is for the first part, which is going to talk about embedded systems. And I'm going to demonstrate that platform-based design can scale vertically, and I'll show you what that means, to not only allow abstraction and modularity, but also maintain accuracy and efficiency. And so the talk goes a little something like this. The factors I mentioned, heterogeneity and complexity, lead to the goals, modularity and abstraction. And then I'm going to talk about a case study for the universal mobile telecommunications system in a design environment we've created at Berkeley called Metro 2. Hopefully I'll convince you that this is both accurate and efficient, and you can convince yourself this would help you in meeting time to market requirements and getting embedded systems out the door. The second piece of my talk is that synthetic biological systems, their design will be challenging. And I don't say that to imply that they're easy now, but what's going to make them difficult in the future, I need to address. And so what is synthetic biology? Well, you know, one view of this is that biology or genetic engineering is built on three ideas. One is that of recombinant DNA. That's taking DNA from different sources and putting it together. Then on top of there's a technology called polymerase chain reaction where we can take these individual DNA templates and exponentially amplify them. So we have more copies to work with. Then the other piece is automated sequencing, and that allows you to take genetic information, genetic material, and determine its DNA sequence. So synthetic biology, in my definition, is building three things on top. One is abstractions. So instead of thinking about DNA sequences as individual nucleotide base pairs, we probably want to think about them as a function. In this case, a promoter, and then a coding sequence. So start to build iconography, start to abstract some of this. Or we may think of the system. In this case, I just offer an example that there's something called the systems biology markup language where you can start to talk about gene expression as kind of a high-level human-readable language. On top of abstractions, synthetic biology is going to need automated assembly. So once I've decided the individual genetic constructs I'd like to make, how can we automate them being created in a lab environment? And then on top of all of this, we're going to need different standards, and standards in three areas. We're going to need standards to talk about part exchange, how we share these biological parts. We need to talk about part standardization, how we represent them, and also standards for their performance metrics. So why is any of this difficult? Well, because biology is inherently empirical, so there's uncertainty we need to deal with. We need to figure out at this early stage what are the meaningful abstractions, and we also need to come to some consensus on the standards. So what is this going to look like? What should a biological part be? How should we talk about its interchange format? So what we need, in my opinion, is an integrated design environment. So we need a whole framework to do this that allows you to do flexible database support. That's going to let us deal with individual parts and share them. That kind of gets to the standards part. And come up with a meaningful semantic. A semantic being operations and relationships between genetic material, in this case, biological parts. So the second part of my talk really gets at, I want to demonstrate that platform-based design can scale horizontally, and I'll show you what that means, to allow the things I mentioned, abstraction standards in automated assembly and synthetic biology, while still being flexible, because we don't know where this field is going all the way, and also to provide a meaningful data model. So this part of the talk, I've mentioned the needs of abstraction standards in automated assembly. I'll give us some examples, and then from that I'll talk about a design flow and a tool I created called Clotho, and that will show how we can do automated assembly. And the outcomes, hopefully, is that I'll show you that this is somewhat flexible and has this meaningful data model. Okay, so Doug, great. We've seen your objectives, we see that there's some challenges, but you've been talking about platform-based design. What the heck is that? Well, let me put it into a context. So computer-aided design is using a computer to design something. You could be in civil engineering, you could be mechanical CAD, you could be a draftsman. But then electronic design automation is using a computer to design an electronic system. So these are companies we're familiar with: Synopsys, Cadence, Mentor Graphics. And then on top of that, when we raise the level of abstraction, we're talking about electronic system level design. And there are tools that start to address that. System C, System Verilog, companies like BlueSpec. And then platform-based design is a methodology on top, which is embodied by these three tools we've created at Berkeley. And so I kind of think about this as kind of like you have martial arts as CAD. And then within CAD, you have different martial arts. That could be, I could be an expert in jujitsu. And then within jujitsu, there are different philosophies within that. And that's what platform-based design is. So moreover, platform-based design is set into two different areas. The first is the application space. This is what a system does. So let me say that my mom gives me a grocery list. That's my specification. That's what I need to do. And then the second piece is an architectural space. This is how a design is realized. So I'm a multimillionaire, let's say, and I've got to go to the grocery store to get these groceries for my mom. And in my garage, I've got a helicopter, a plane, high-speed motorcycle, and a Lamborghini. Those are the ways I could implement going to the store to get those lists. And so what's important then is that the functional space is constrained, and then the architectural space is exported back up to to the functional space. And what happens is they meet in the middle of a place called the platform. So if I'm my example of going to the store, what's going to be important is I'm going to need to know how much my car can carry, because that'll tell me how many groceries I can get. I need to know how fast it can go, because that will talk about how long it takes me to accomplish this task. I need to know how much fuel it would take, because that would talk about the overall cost of going to the store. And a Lamborghini might be cost prohibitive, or a jet even more so. So again, a real brief example. Let's say I wanted to build a car out of Legos. You would constrain the car specification to this platform of Legos. So you would say, well, maybe we can't have lights because Legos don't light up maybe. Or we need to, the tires are going to be kind of wobbly, or they're going to be very squarish because we have Legos. But you accept those constraints. And then you build an individual car instance out of those Legos. Now, in the first part, I said that platform-based design was going to scale vertically to enable embedded system design. So what is vertical? It's this fractal nature of design, that the design process repeats itself at various levels of abstraction. So let's say we start with the specification of an embedded electronic system. That's the spec, and then the platform we might have, our mouse computation. In this case, I could convert that down to a Petri net. At the next level, that Petri net then could be converted into a microarchitecture. That microarchitecture then becomes a system of gates. And then those gates then become mapped into standard cells. So again, you can see this design process repeating itself at many levels. Then the other piece I said was it was going to scale horizontally to meet the challenges of systems biology or synthetic biology. So the idea is that we have in one domain a standard embedded system. Can we apply it to synthetic biological systems? Can we say that the function is I want to expose bacteria to a particular light and have them produce pigment? What are the building blocks or the DNA elements that I can assemble to meet that functionality? So that's the general framework. So the first part of my talk is going to go into embedded systems. And I'm going to talk about a platform-based design flow for embedded electronic systems using Metro 2. And I focus on the bottom half of that triangle. I focus on developing embedded system cost models of architectures. And there's three things that could go into that: modeling, characterization, refinement. These two are green because I'm going to focus on these in my talk. And I'm going to talk us through a UMTS case study that's coming up in a paper I'll present in France for date. So let me just give a brief history of the development of platform-based design tools at UC Berkeley. So it started in the mid-90s, mid to late 90s, with a tool called Polis. It was based on something called co-designed finite state machines. This is a model of computation that's globally asynchronous, locally synchronous, similar to a finite state machine, but when the transitions between states can be assigned a time, or how long that takes to occur. So it's a model of computation with the notion of timing. And it became a tool at Cadence. Then in the late 90s, early 2000s, when I came to Berkeley, I worked on Metropolis. And the idea was that the co-designed finite state machines were too limited. And what we wanted to do was have a Metropolis meta model, which had processes, that was computation, media, that was communication, and quantity managers, which were coordination of the system, explicitly separate. And then we could build many more models of computation than co-designed finite state machines could. And we did a large body of case studies. I was involved with case studies at Intel, Xilinx, Cypress, Infineon, and GM to kind of explore the kind of systems we could represent with this framework. And then in 2005, myself and others, we led the development of something called Metro 2, and we took a step back. And we said, Metropolis isn't doing some things particularly well, and what did we really want to focus on? We wanted to focus on more heterogeneous IP import. So instead of this heavy-handed meta-model syntax, we wanted to have a more flexible wrapper syntax. We also wanted to have a cleaner execution semantic. So we really wanted to cleanly separate things that were computing from things that were communicating from things that were coordinating. And we also wanted to keep an event-oriented framework. And I'll talk about that event-oriented framework and why that was important. So just some folks are like, so let me give a little quick, just 2-second literature. Folks want to look at these slides later, look at this and say, where does the two triangles fit in? The point is that we have papers that talk about how we transform functional descriptions. We have papers that talk about how we enforce constraints. I've written papers on how we refine these models. And we also have papers on how we model complex architectures. So we've covered all of this space using the Metropolis framework. And we're working on that in the Metro 2 framework. So all of these are covered in different literature reviews. So the Metro 2 basics. So I'm going to introduce you to the Metro 2 system. Then I'm going to walk us through a case study, and hopefully that'll illustrate some of the strengths. So Metro 2 is based on System C 2.2. System C is a set of libraries built on C++ to what they've attempted to do is create a transaction-level modeling environment where we have concurrent processes communicating through channels and allows you to represent various embedded in electronic systems. So the core of Metro 2 is a component. And you can take your IP or you can begin with a new design. There's a lightweight wrapper syntax, and we become a component. A component is imperative sequential code being executed by a process. Then components have ports, in this case a required port. And what happens are these components generate events which are associated to required ports. So required port, you can think of me saying, I need a service. I want to do something, so I'll generate an event. The event I generate is a process. It knows who generated me, a value set, and a set of tags. Then there are other components which have provided ports. They provide that service. They do not have a process. So they inherit from the required port the event and the process. They do meaningful work. Then they return the process and the event back to the required port. Then the execution semantics revolve around the scheduling of these events. So required ports are generating events. And then there are execution semantics that allow for events to be annotated, scheduled, constraints solved over those, and mapping, which creates a relationship between events in different places of the model. And I'll explain how mappers work and how they create something called a rendezvous constraint. So the general idea, if you say, OK, I went to this talk, what should I take away from this? You should take away that we've explicitly separated things that compute, components, from pieces that annotate events, from pieces that coordinate events. So it's all orthogonal. So we've created this system. Just a brief syntax example for those that will say, well, what does this look like? If I was to sit down and code Metro 2, what does it look like? Again, it's built on top of System C. So there's a Metro 2 component, which is derived from an SC component or an SC module in System C. You explicitly enumerate the port you'd like to have. They have an associated interface. You explicitly mention the events which that component should be able to generate. And then you also explicitly tie those events to ports to function calls on ports, because that's when those events will be emitted into the system. So the execution semantics. You assemble a collection of components. They all will generate ports on their required port, and they'll block. So processes begin running. They propose these events, or they block internally, and there's some internal synchronization mechanisms. And then those events that are proposed then go from being inactive to proposed. Then once everything is proposed, an event that can in that round, all the processes will be suspended, and we'll switch to the second phase. The events that were proposed then become annotated. Remember, an event is a process with value and tags. So this is a stage in which values are given, which can indicate the cost of computation, and tags are changed, which give a partial ordering or can infer causality on the events. Then they proceed to annotated. Then the third phase, those events are scheduled. So all the events proposed come together. Individual schedulers can look at them and decide which events to enable. Some of them will be disabled and keep their annotation. Some will be disabled but must be re-annotated. And then some processes will then be enabled. So their events will be enabled, and then they will move from suspended to running, and then the process proceeds. So the question now, everyone's like, oh, okay, this is crazy. You got this crazy three-phase events. What's going on? What's the point? So why bother with any of this? I've got System C. Well, Doug, we don't need any of this. Well, something that I'm not going to be able to go into is this is all based on something called the tag signal model, which came about by Professor Alberto Sangiovanni Vincentelli and Edward Lee at UC Berkeley around 1996. And what they showed is that the tag signal model, creating events in this way with these particular relationships, is extremely expressive. We talk about the fact that you can do con-process networks, data flow, sequential processes, discrete event systems. And what happens when you do that is that I can naturally express a great deal of functionality this way. And then I can also create architectural services, or those costs coming bottom up, which have the same semantic domain. So that mapping becomes very natural. And also something I talk about is refinement. So if I make a model at a high level of abstraction, then I make a lower level model. The idea is that the lower level model's behaviors should be encapsulated by the more abstract. So the refined model can't produce any behavior not seen by the more abstract model. Now what's nice about this event model, and this paper is a reference to this, is that I talk about how we can go about enforcing these properties. So it's very nice that I don't have to reason about all the model's behavior. I have to look at models that are generated, events rather, that are generated on ports, capture those events in a formal model control flow graph, and then I can traverse that and talk about state equivalence and state encapsulation. The other piece that's nice about this is the separation of concerns. So this allows for a large design space. The computation is separate from the communication, is separate from the coordination. So I can keep the same communication scheme and pull out different components. Or I can keep the components and change the communication scheme. The other piece is that performance is separated from behavior. So my performance might be that I'm walking, but I can give it different performance metrics. I walk at different speeds. So I can keep the behavioral specification, but change the performance model. And I don't need to redo the entire system. And so what I did early on with some other folks is we took a look at 90 different design frameworks that claim to be electronic system level. And we found that some of them do functional modeling, some of them do architectural modeling, and some of them map them together. If we look at the ones that do both, the industrial approaches are on here on the left, and the academic on the right. And if I just look at some of the advantages that Metro 2 has, for example, the industrial ones are either limited to particular languages or they have fewer models of computation they support. The academic approaches only do con-process networks in one case. The other ones I'm not going to say are any better or any worse, but they just look at starting at different places. So UML or Ptolemy, which is a framework developed at UC Berkeley. So we feel we have a very unique offering. So what I'm going to do is walk us through this case study. And again, it's UMTS, which is a 3G mobile telephony standard. So what did we start with? We started with a spec. This was of the data link layer. Then we created a data flow model that had blocking read, meaning that if I try to read from a FIFO and there's nothing there, the process will block. Blocking write, if I try to write to a full FIFO, the process will block. Then we converted that into System C. Then I wrapped that into Metro 2. So I put the required port and provided port relationships and added the events. We did this for the radial link control and the media access control and the receiver. And we did it for the MAC and the RLC and the transmitter. In all, it was 13 computational units with 12 FIFOs. But what was the goal? What am I going to try to show? where we examined 48 mappings. So a mapping is the functional model assigned to architectural cost models. We did 48 permutations. And we wanted to answer how accurate was this as compared to real systems, how easy was this to do, and the trade-off between utilization and cycle times. And more importantly, maybe for our own gratification, is we wanted to see, was this all worth it? What is the overhead as compared to doing this in another system for System C or another system-level simulation framework? So these are the kind of questions we wanted to answer. So again, I talked about the fact I was going to talk about the bottom half of the triangle. So now I'm going to talk about the cost models in particular that we developed. I'm not going to spend much time talking about UMTS. I'm just going to talk about the architecture of service modeling. There were two types. The first, in this case, the Spark Leon 3, I created a cycle-accurate pipeline which took binaries from an instruction memory and then would execute that binary in a pipeline. So what would happen then is I would map this architectural service to a functional service. And that's creating a correspondence between an events generated in the functional model, then ones generated in the architecture model. When they meet, they can both be allowed to proceed by the third phase of Metro 2. So what happens is an event comes into the system, it's disabled, the mapper then looks up the code corresponding to that event, runs that through the pipeline, then annotates the event, and it goes on to the third phase of execution. So again, what has to happen is the event that can be generated have to have corresponding kernels of code that correspond to what that event should execute. Then another event will come into the system, it'll be disabled, another file will be looked up, it'll run through the pipeline, annotate the event, and then you move on. This was called runtime processing because the cost for the event isn't known until runtime because you don't know the state of the pipeline and it's updated dynamically. The other type of modeling environment was what I'm going to call pre-profiled. Looked very similar, but the difference is inside there's a finite state machine. So the architectural model had some notion of the states it had seen. So let's say I started out in state 1. An event goes in, it's requesting this service on a provided port. It then looks at the current state of the finite state machine and goes to a particular data structure that has characterization values. So it's pre-profiled with information. And it'll say for that type of event, how many cycles in this case maybe should it take. Then when another event comes into the system, now it's in state 2, it'll then again be disabled, look up another line in the table, and then return its event. So this was pre-profiled. And it gives rise to the idea that we both have state-dependent and state-independent information in this type of model. And I'm going to talk about how we created that data model in a minute. Because the question you're all saying is, I can kind of understand probably how you could have binaries that could run through a pipeline. How do you populate that data structure? And I'll talk about that in the coming slide. So putting all of this together, what does the complete architecture system look like for UMTS? You started with a set of tasks. Tasks were one-to-one for the UMTS component. So again, there are 12 components in UMTS, so there are 12 tasks. And tasks are continually saying, I want to do something, I want to do something, I want to do something. And they'll only be allowed when that functional model also wants to do something. That's when they'll do that rendezvous I spoke of. So they have threads running, trying to propose events on required ports. The operating system then looks something like this. And then you have a number of processing elements. First thing you do is you assign a mapping of many to one, many tasks to one processor. So maybe I'll take the first task, map it to processor 1, the second two to processor 2, last to processor n. What the operating system lets us do is provide a layer of explicit scheduling on top of the implicit scheduling being done in the third stage of Metropolis. So this gives us an extra dimension of investigation. So what happens is the tasks on their required ports all generate events. Those events then go to the provided port of the operating system where they're queued up and disabled. Then using a variety of scheduling mechanisms, first come, first serve, round robin, priority, we would then activate those events. And that's separate from the third phase scheduling. So this is where we could add this extra layer. Then they would be requested on the provided ports of the processing elements, and then they would proceed in the manner I showed in the previous slide with the pipeline and the finite state machine. So again, I showed that data drum in the pre-profiled. So how does that get populated? One way is we started with the application code of the core kernels of UMTS. Then we ran that through target compilation, in this case for the ARM7 and ARM9 processors. That resulted in a binary. We then fed that binary to virtual hardware. That virtual hardware then gives a performance trace. Then we take those three components and put it to the source level timing annotation tool that we have. And an extraction script puts us in this performance data model. So the idea is at the end I started with some C code, ran it through this code. The end result is that code is then annotated with the cycles required for that particular machine for each of those particular functions, those lines in that code. Then I extracted out with the script the lines associated with function calls and required ports and put that in the drum. So that's how long they would take. The other piece is how do we do this for the FPGA platform? How do we do this for the soft processors, the microblaze system? We had a library of pieces. We throw them in a bag and shake them up, and we get all these different permutations. So these are the different ways it could be done. These are the different connections. So you put a constraint. You say, I'd only want 1 or 2 microblazes. I'd only want 1 core connect bus. Different permutations you were willing to accept in your design space. Then you had some applications, and you assigned those to different cores. Then you'd run this. So there was 2 pieces. So in these designs when I ran them, there was a profile that they could extract the number of cycles. If I put a timer on the board or in a hardware timer, I could talk about how many cycles these took. Then the EDK, you'd run these, actually synthesize these designs, and that lets you know information statically, like the longest path or the clock cycle that was possible. So when you have that clock cycle along with a number of cycles, you can give some indication of the actual execution time. And this is all done once. So you pre-profile this, put this in the drum. So that's essentially how that drum was developed. So let me step you through the whole thing. I'm going to put all of it together, and hopefully you'll see how all these pieces work. Again, we created our functional model. This was the UMTS data flow. I turned it into Metro 2, so I created those required and provided ports, which are going to generate events. Then I put down an architectural service. I said, well, what do I want? Well, I want an ARM7, a Spark, and a microblaze. I'm going to map everything to these 3 processors. Then I mapped it. So that's assigning the task in the functional model to the task in the architectural model. Those mappings generate those rendezvous constraints. So that says when event in functional arrives, event in architecture needs to be present, it generates automatically an event. That goes to the constraint solver that's going to be used in the 3rd phase. Then they're going to generate events. So the functional model is going to generate events, and the architectural model is going to generate events. Proposes on its required port to provided, proposes on the required port to divided. Similarly in the function model, again, everything has proposed an event that can, switches phases. Those events are then annotated, so they're given their values and tags are updated. They go to the 3rd phase. Then it switches phases. That constraint is satisfied. They're both present. The functional model events are enabled. The architectural events, which carry information that increases the simulation time, update the logical time scheduler of the simulation. Then they're enabled. Return to the functional model. Now the OS on its required ports generates events. They go to the architectural services. The Spark is runtime. It looks up the code, runs it through the pipeline. The microblaze looks up the time in its data structure, sends that information to the annotator, so it knows how long those events should take. The simulation proceeds. And it continues doing this, accumulating information in these schedulers about execution time and any other metrics of interest. We'd explore execution time, and I also explore something called utilization. So what are the kind of results we got out of this? Again, this is a lot to look at, but what I want to point out is several things. One, the x-axis of the 48 different mappings, and it's ordered in terms of increasing execution time, which is on this y-axis, or you can think of it increasingly poor performance. And then there are 3 lines, and then there's also utilization. So utilization as well is measured as a percentage. And you can think of utilization in this case study as saying, how much was I able to use a processing element? So low utilization means I'm the processor sitting there, I propose an event, I propose an event, I propose an event. And nobody was using me. No one was making that rendezvous. So you can think of if I have a low utilization, I have more hardware than I would need. And so we did this for 3 scheduling: priority, first come, first serve, and round robin. And you can see the performance for the execution time basically breaks into 4 plateaus. So if I'm doing design space exploration and I want lowest execution time, I can immediately remove all of those. I'm not interested in those. This is often what we want to do. We don't necessarily say we know that this is 50 cycles and I'm guaranteeing it's 50 cycles. We really just want to prune out the design space and say we don't need to even examine these. So we could do that. And then within this lowest plateau, you can see that the utilization varies widely. And so maybe if I'm interested in saying I don't want a system that's overly specified, you then would investigate the ones that have the utilization metrics of interest. So we actually pushed some of these to the board, and these are the percent differences that the real implementations had from their estimated. The 11 microblaze and 1 microblaze systems are very close. The smaller microblaze is when we're mapping all 12 components on 4 pieces, and it was difficult to actually tease out all the scheduling as well as we should have. And that's why the difference is greater. But it's still, I would contend, reasonable for this level of abstraction. The other piece I said,
Is there a reason you have sort of performance numbers for the poorly performing ones as opposed to the ones that seem to be the ones you suggest?
So some of the ones that we actually have some in the paper, but not as many as we'd like. The lower ones are more of a mix of both the Spark and the other. There's more architecture. So for me to get a Spark embedded board and program that was unfortunately more work. But that's a good. That's what we need to do often to validate this in the future, is to get those numbers. So the other question I said was, okay, Doug, again, I got this, but is this going to take so long? Is this so much overhead that this isn't worth it? This this chart talks about this. So there's the 48 mappings were broken into about 9 classes. You could also say there are ones that only use runtime processing, the Spark, some that use the pure profiling, some are a mix, and then the average. The blue line is how much time was spent in phase 1. The red line, phase 2, that was the annotation. The green line, phase 3. And the idea that we wanted to show, and we would contend, that phase 1 is analogous to the system simulation time that would be in the normal environment. So you would have gotten that time anyways. The green and red is the overhead associated with Metro 2. And for runtime processing, for example, the average is 93% of the time is spent in phase 1. That would have been spent in any simulation environment, in particular System C. So our overheads there are very minimal. On average, it's 61% in phase 1, 5% in phase 2, and 17% in phase 3. Again, we feel that phase 2 and phase 3 do not add any kind of negative impact on our overall simulation. We processed 7,000 packets through UMTS, and on average it was about 54 seconds. So even in general, this didn't take a great deal of time. So again, what this kind of brought us back down and said, okay, this is okay. And we also showed that, again, I talked about this in the paper a little bit, that the events seen in the second and third phases, it's constant or linear in some cases. So it doesn't have a large blow up in events generated as we change these mappings. So what this basically did is give us confidence in our method. So what's the future directions? Where are we taking Metropolis? Okay, I've seen embedded system design, that's passé, maybe that's what you're saying. Well, we're moving into other areas. So the DOP, the Donald Peterson Center at Berkeley, is on the 5th floor of Corey Hall. And it's got a lot of rooms, and if you've ever been there, you know the temperature varies widely, and sometimes you're cold, sometimes you're warm. So some of us said, you know, we really should figure out a better way to map the sensors and actuators that turn on the fans in a more optimal way. So the problem then becomes, we want to design an optimal mapping of rooms to controllers that minimizes the power, so we can say, hey, we saved the department some money, and then we also maintain the required ambient temperature. So what I want to do is come up with Metropolis to do this, Metro 2. So what we do is we've modeled the controllers, the digital controllers, which say turn sensor on, or rather sense, and then turn actuator on or off. In Metropolis, we can make a model of the controller, we can make a model of the sensor and the actuator. But the environment is a continuous time system. So what we've done is we've integrated Metro 2, the kind of discrete system, with Modelica model of the ambient temperature of Metro 2, of the DOP center. And this is work that we're continually finishing up to come up with an optimal communication network. And on top of this, Metro 2 ties into another tool written by a student named Alessandro Pinto at UC Berkeley for a tool called COSY, which does communication synthesis. So once we've determined the optimal number of controllers, we can also use that tool to come up with an optimal network of the communication between controllers to minimize latency. So I just want to point out here that Metro 2 is more than just a way to design embedded systems in the traditional sense of system on a chip, but we can also start to think about the larger environment. So again, a lot of stuff, but I hope that gives you some sort of flavor of the work that I'm doing in embedded systems and how we try to build on this formal event-based framework to build systems that we can prove properties about and also build efficient simulation environments with. The second half of my talk now is I'm going to talk about a platform-based design flow for synthetic biological systems using a tool called Clotho that I created. And in synthetic biology, again, I was saying there's about 3 things: abstraction, assembly, and standards. And really what I want to do is only focus on these top 2. I unfortunately don't have time in the 50-minute talk to get into standards. That's a large talk in of itself. And I'm going to talk about this primarily in the context of a sample design flow for automated assembly. And I just point out here that this was a successful tool, Clotho. This past year, as mentioned in my introduction, we won the International Genetically Engineered Machine Competition for Best Software Tool. We also won a gold medal. And this is work that I have a team of 8 undergrads working on with me. And also I work with J. Christopher Anderson, who's a bioengineer at UC Berkeley. So what is synthetic biology as an overview? So all of this could be thought of as biological engineering. if you look at things that would maybe called protein engineering or promoter engineering, you're usually looking at individual nucleotides to create something, one base pair, to hundreds of base pairs. But parts, a biological part would be then these sequences that are 0.1 to 3 kilobases, so getting larger systems. Devices are then collections of parts, and then you start leading up to the whole genome of an organism. And the reason this attracted me, why I came from engineering and got attracted to this, is I found that there was a place called the Registry of Standardized Parts at MIT, where they have all these different parts. They have things that are called terminators, which talk about how transcription occurs, ribosome binding sites, translation, regulatory elements, reporters, all these pieces that they say, these are parts. And they have little icons, and they have DNA sequences associated with them. And what they show are there are devices, like light sensors, movement, logical circuits, that are individual instances of these. So I thought, well, let's go back to platform-based design. What was that? That was functionality. And then we had a platform. In this case, maybe this registry is a platform of these parts. How do we go down and assemble these in interesting ways? And then we have trade-offs. Some have, they have different biological costs in terms of their efficiency, in terms of their predictability, if they work with other biological parts. So this is kind of what inspired me to think about this. And just some examples. These are, again, taken from the International Genetically Engineered Machine Competition. It gives you some feel of what's going on. So this is an XOR gate that was made by Davidson, Missouri Western University. And then the idea is not to fully understand this for the EECS audience, but just to understand that an XOR gate, we all know, if both inputs are 0, the output is 0. If they're both 1, the output is 0. But if one or the other is 1, then you'll get an output of a 1. Now, in this case, what is a 1? It's the production of a protein. And what this arrow here is something called a promoter. And promoters can be inducible, and they can also be repressible. So promoters are what begin transcription, so the process of turning DNA into mRNA. So that's going to eventually code for a gene. What happens here, in the presence of these particular proteins, the production of this protein can be turned on and off, but only if one or the other is present. So you can see that this protein induces here, while represses here, induces here, represses here. So you can see this, they make OR gates. So this team made this kind of hash function in E. coli. That was an interesting project. Another project at the National Yang Ming University made something called Bacto kidney. They wanted to make genetically engineered bacteria to enter the kidney, detect pH, remove urea and other toxins, and have it flush out. So again, the point is not to read all this, but they made something that was a urea transporter and something that also transported guanidines. And this, again, that's a hard one for me. The point is not to fully understand this again, but to see, look, they have the same kind of parts that we saw in the registry. Someone needs to assemble these. Someone needs to store these. Someone needs to talk about how they share. And someone needs to predict their performance at some point. Say, will this work with other systems to the best of our ability? And that's where I see the opportunity at. So as I said, we need to assemble these, store them, and analyze them. Here's just another thing that threw off, and I'm presenting this at ISCUS in Taipei. Imagine, the other thing that mentioned, I was talking to someone, and someone's like, are you going to make biological computers? Well, perhaps. But more often, this logical functionality will be, say, if I detect pH, burst lyse, so the cell will burst, then release protein if this is present. So these kind of logical operations. And so that may manifest itself or be most accurately represented as what we might think of as a logic diagram. But you have to remember this is in solution. So there's not this spatial separation like we have in CMOS or in silicon. So if I have a gate here, an AND gate, the production of its proteins here are also going to turn this AND gate on. So they interfere. And maybe I need a NAND gate, but I don't even have that. Well, the idea is that I could take typical Boolean algebraic postulates and then reduce this to a circuit that has the same functional behavior, but then we actually can make this in a biological setting. So this is the kind of things that I'm interested going forward in, is thinking about, can we do this? Is this going to work? I don't know yet. But I think this is worth investigating, and I think if it does work, which I think is going to have applications, we can then leverage a lot of other CAD tools. So what's the current environment? What's going on? I got a computer, it's in the lab. Now I want to use the tools on this, so I've got some starting design files. But they don't really quite work the way I want. So then I've got to break them up, and it's manual, and I put them into multiple files. This is dealing with A, T, C's, and G's. Oh, I switched an A, or I put a T, or I inserted a point mutation. I've messed it up. So that's dangerous. It's manual. And then when they talk to the computer, maybe I mess it up, so there's this iterative process trying to get stuff on a computer. Maybe that's not as efficient as it could be. And then the tools on the computer don't necessarily talk to one another. So let's get rid of all this. Let's get a database on here. So I have this fancy lab database. We finally clean these files up. We take the genetic information that's interesting, we put it in the lab database. Well, let's hope that that lab database exists and that we don't have some proprietary IP issues. And then I'm like, well, I want to get really savvy and start sharing with another lab. Do they have a database? And are there any standards to share data? So I can improve this with a global repository. This could be a standard. But who knows if I want to put things in there? In the biological sciences, it's very important that often things are IP, or I want to guard things, because their currency is their design they create, that they're going to explain to you how to replicate exactly in their paper. So if they're not ready to release that paper, they don't want to necessarily make their parts available at this time. So how do we do security? And let's say even we can get around this. Again, do the tools have any idea of a common data model or support? So this got me thinking about what we needed was this integrated design environment with this flexible database support. So if we look at what's the tool landscape, there are three types of tools in synthetic biology, in my opinion. Those that do computation and simulation, those that do design and analysis, and those that do data management. We populated, there are a number of offerings. So there's the parts registry at MIT, there's something called Visibrick at Davidson, Biomortar at Waterloo, a tool I really think is interesting here at Washington called Tinkercell, tool at UCB called BioJade, all these different tools. Of course, I position Clotho to be in the middle of this Venn diagram. But when I do that and I look at what tools, what I've created, it subsumes the tools that I've made disappear. So APE, for example, I've completely replaced all its functionality. Tools like BioJade, which I mentioned, is written by a guy at UCB. I've taken what he wrote, because it's in Java, and put it into Clotho. And then the remaining tools, I've directly contacted the folks there and had meetings with them, and we're starting to develop a plan to get these tools into Clotho. So what if I were to say, if I was selling Clotho, I would say I would position Clotho as beginning to do things that no other tool has done, and the tools that exist, it has their functionality. So what's the Clotho design environment at a 50,000-foot view? It's centered around the Clotho data model. And what's nice about the Clotho data model is I can bring in database information or data files into things called Clotho connectors. That will speak to the data model. There are views and functions. Those will also speak to the data model. Algorithm environment, a plugin environment, and interfaces. And they all speak data model. So what happens is the connectors, and I'll talk about this, do a translation from potentially non-standard data into standardized data. And then this is, again, a big view of the project. But people want to say, what does the software architecture look like? It's about 130 files. It's written in Java 6. And there are several things I want to point on this diagram, even though I understand you can't read all of it. The first is that there's Clotho as a core. The core communicates to 4 hubs. Hubs have connections, and each connection has a user interface. So again, in platform-based design ideas, this is all modular. So if you don't like the particular aspect of Clotho, I can write a plugin. If I don't like the UI for a connection, I can swap in and out its UI. If I want to write a new connection, I simply do it. I instantiate it with a hub. Then there's a global addressing system that's done automatically, where the hub then keeps the address of the individual connections, and they communicate to one another. So as a designer, I need to know very little about Clotho to plug something new in and have it begin to integrate with the whole system. So what's the data model integration? So you can think of there being 2 things, organized data and unorganized data. So really I should say standardized data and unstandardized data. So with the unstandardized data, there's this notion of a translation or a binding file. So if I go into a database, maybe I don't even speak English, or I just call the sequence stuff. Then what happens is there's a binding between what stuff is and what that means for Clotho. So again, I use this like an English translator. So maybe I say hablar. And in Spanish, that means to speak. So then, of course, the translation from hablar to English would be speak. And we've established that translation in Clotho. And we do it once. The database designer or manager of this unorganized data will do this. Then what allows Clotho to do is then, once you're standardized, any standardized database that speaks Clotho data model can accept it directly. Then we can also pass back standardized data, reverse translate it, and put it into unstandardized data models. Then the other piece is, imagine there's going to be other databases, not just ones that speak the Clotho data model. So we can make very standardized translators here that don't have to be as custom, that no one has to write, we have to write, that allows us to go from the Clotho data model to standard data, and vice versa back out. So the idea, again, is one of the motivations for this was that I've realized at this point in synthetic biology, there aren't the standards for the parts. So if I want to make any progress right now, I need to maintain these translations be flexible. In the future, what I'd like is this, because we'll have set some standards and we won't need any of these translators. But right now they exist, and I think it keeps it extremely flexible. It allows it to talk to MySQL databases. In the future, I'm working on Oracle database. I'm working on other parts repositories written in other scripting languages and web services, things like that. So, with the last pieces of my talk here, I'm going to walk us through the design flow for assembling standardized parts. So what I'm showing here, you can think of abstractly, is I want to take the blue part, which is a DNA sequence, and mix it with the green part, and have the blue part, green part be my final output. They're in these circular pieces because these are called plasmids. These are circular pieces of DNA often found in bacteria. And the yellow area is a selectable marker. In this case, it's an antibiotic resistance, which allows us to, we can select these plasmids away. It's for design. But the goal for this from a CS perspective is that we're going to combine blue with green. What's important is on each side of these parts, there are specific sequences. In this case, EchoR1 and XBA1. And on the other side, SPE1 and PST1. And these are the two strands of DNA. They have these particular sequences. And what happens is when we add a particular enzyme, those sequences get cut. So you have a DNA strand, double-stranded. The sequence is cut and leave these ends that stick off. Those are called sticky ends. And then when you notice, what I want to do, I've cut this such that the E is open and the X is open. As you would imagine, when I put these together, the E overhang here matches the E sticky end here, so that'll stick together. But how do the S and X stick together? Well, that's because they have compatible sticky ends in this protocol. That's why it was designed this way. So the end result, when you stick this all back together, you mix it and ligate it, you get this final part. And what's key to notice about this, at the end, you have the E and X sites here again, and the S and P sites. So that's what we began with. So we can then repeat this process. So naturally, this gives me a path toward thinking about how we can assemble these. So you have primitive parts, then they go through an assembly step, you get a compound part, and you have a final goal part. And you can imagine, just looking at this, if I have the goal part A, B, C, D, there's two different ways I could make it. One, I would have 4 steps and 3 stages. Another, I'd have 4 steps and 4 stages. What I'd like to do is minimize the number of stages and steps. Stages are things you can do independently. Steps correspond to a reaction. Those reactions translate eventually, ultimately, both into cost, because there's chemical reagents that are consumed, and they also represent potential places that could error or flaws could be introduced. So you want to minimize stages and steps. So what would be nice in creating A, B, C, and B, C, D is to create intermediates which can be shared. And so what we'd like to do is, as I said, minimize the assembly stages and steps. And I'm going to show you a dynamic programming algorithm that I've created to do this. And it includes 3 heuristics, something called slack, something called degrees of freedom, and another factor called sharing. And I'm going to briefly introduce those to you. So this is something called SDS Assembly, slack, degrees of freedom, and sharing. The first heuristic is slack. So let's say I make this part, A, B, C, D, and I make it this way. Okay, that's a nice local minimum. It has 2 stages and 3 steps. Now let's say I want to make 2 parts. I want to make A, B, C, D, and I want to make E, F, B, C, D. If I make A, B, C this way and E, F, B, C, D this way, I have a global cost of 3 stages and 7 steps. But let's say I said that this A, B, C, D could stretch. I can make it in more steps. So if I stretch it and take more steps in the local min, so I take 3 stages instead of 2 stages, now I notice I can share BCD, and it lowers the global cost to 3 stages and 5 steps. So the idea is that these assemblies are determined by the longest path of a tree, and the trees that are less than should be able to grow and shrink in order to share intermediate parts. That's the general idea. The other part is degrees of freedom, the idea that if I want to make this tree minimally, there's only one degree of freedom, 1 for this, for A, B, C, D. But for A, B, C, there are 2 ways to make it. So for different trees, there are more or less ways to make them naturally. And in any algorithm, when I'm starting to permute them, some of them can move less or more. I want to shake the ones that can move more. There's more chances I can find sharing. And the final part is something I'll call sharing. And the idea is that if I have a cost 1, I can say it's less than cost 2 if the stages of 1 are less than the stages of 2. So in all cases, if I have fewer stages, I'm less. I should cost less. So if I'm trying to make a tree, if I have fewer stages, okay, I'm lower cost. But if the stages are the same, how do I decide? Well, if they're the same, before when we thought about this, we just said whichever had fewer steps should win. but we're amortizing the fact that I may take more steps, but I minus the amount of sharing that part could be theoretically used. So I look across all the goal parts and see where that subpart potentially could occur, and I try to allow that to take some role into the overall cost picture. So the algorithm overview, the first thing we do is we use dynamic programming to build the minimum cost graphs for all of them. So we build all the goal parts, we determine the longest one, that sets our slack. So this is what we've got to get everything to fit within. The second stage is that we look at the goal parts just as strings. We identify all the subparts, and we see what's the potential best case sharing for all of these if they were shared optimally, which we know that couldn't occur, but we get what that number would be. Then we use dynamic programming. It's dynamic programming because this optimal substructure in these trees. So once you compute the best cost for one goal part or a subpart of that tree, you don't need to recompute it. And we do that when we try to compare which one's better. We use that cost calculation I just showed. So we take sharing into account, and we take slack into account. Then once I've built all the trees for that one round, we take a look at them. We lock the ones that are at least degrees of freedom. We add those parts to a library saying they're effectively free now. Then we rerun it again, and we rebuild the trees with that information. So you iteratively lock these parts until you have a final assembly set. So how is this going to work with Clotho? How does this work for automated assembly? You start with your data source. You go to your repository. You say, OK, I want to assemble these goal parts. So I go into the database. I find the goal parts I'd like to assemble. I pull them out. The top half of this is the flow in Clotho. The bottom half is the implementation. Then I map this. So that was when I showed that crazy Clotho data structure. So I take the parts here, and then I map them into the Clotho data model. That gives me a set of theoretical parts. Now, what do I mean by a theoretical part? If I say ATCG, I've just given you a theoretical part. I don't know if there's a freezer in this whole building that has ATCG. So a theoretical part is just a sequence. But then you can use Clotho to go to the database. Some parts viewer tools we have. There's a parts manager and something that looks like a virtual plate. And then I can find out where those parts actually live in the lab. So I can say, these are the parts I want to assemble. This is where they actually live in the lab. And I can do that because I'm talking to a database. Then there's an algorithm environment in Clotho where I then run my SDS algorithm on these parts. Then I get my big assembly tree. Now I have the assembly tree. I know where the primitive parts are in terms of where they are in the freezer or where they are on a 96-well plate. Then then the tool actually gives you a pipetting algorithm to pipette those parts into to create that tree. So we've gone from picking parts out all the way through to automated assembly. So that goes through the physical flow, and people have asked me, where am I going with Clotho? Where's the future work? Where's the direction for this? Well, Clotho is the core. So those that are familiar with Greek mythology know that Clotho was responsible for spinning the thread of life. Clotho spun your life. So Clotho is where the design begins, where life begins. And so what I envision Clotho being is a very robust data management piece, where we have ways to connect to lots of databases and set standards, bring in unstandardized databases, clean them up in our Clotho data model, et cetera. So I envision that as a data management infrastructure. The second sister was Lachesis. And Lachesis talked about how long your life should be. So the quality of your life. So what's the quality of a design? A quality design is the ability to start thinking about visualizing it, bringing in different abstraction levels. The other piece is to think about how can we start thinking about simulation. So now you've got these parts. Maybe I can start to take some of the genetic information I have in these databases and start thinking about running computational algorithms on this. So that's what I envision as Lachesis. And I envision this as being a collection of plugins that go with Clotho to begin to do these activities. Then the final sister, Atropos, she was responsible for cutting the thread of life. It's kind of a downer. She ended your life. But in the world of this framework, ending your life is then going to assembly. So once we've done our design, it's time to go out into the real world and see how it works. So we need to make it. So the Atropos plugins would be the third framework. And then all of this would be something that I call Mirai, which is going to be the kind of this fate system of describing these three activities. And then a little sneak preview of the iGEM 2009 team that I'm running at UC Berkeley for this summer is what is the development plan for this? So you can imagine from a kind of a sales point that I have three archetypes. I'm biofuels guy, I'm biosensors guy, I'm therapeutics guy. Each of these have different activities they want to do. I call these workflows. What I'd like to develop is something called, the Mirai description language, which is going to capture these workflows. And what might be some ways we do this? There's a project called Kepler at UCB, which allows you to talk about workflows. It's based on Ptolemy. There's a language written here by folks in Herbert Sauer's lab called antimony. I'd like to think about integrating this. It should be some kind of description language that lets you talk about the things you'd like to do in a biological sense, whether it be gene expression or running individual Clotho operations in this combined framework. I expect to put 2 students on that this summer. And then Clotho, that piece will be made more robust by tying it to the Joint Bioenergy Institute's registry. So this is a consortium, actually a laboratory run in Emeryville, California, home of Pixar, with a guy named Jay Kiesling, professor at UC Berkeley. So I'm going to tie it to another registry. Then I'd love to take this and put some bioengineering students and work on the visualization analysis department. So we're going to take these ATCs and Gs and add icons on them and start talking about how we can think about systems at that level perhaps, and then connect to a variety of different automation pieces, so different robots. So with that, I kind of leave with the contributions, the things I hope I showed you guys. And that is, we've developed a platform-based design environment for embedded system design, and we did this with Metro 2 in a UMTS case study. Again, if you think, what was the point of all that? We had an event-based semantics, and that was in the tag signal model, and that allowed a very large design space exploration. By decoupling the functional model from the architectural model, we could do a lot of different things. I showed that it's fairly accurate, within 16% in the worst case I showed. Efficient, it was very easy to do, take my word for it. We just had to manipulate a top-level net list. And on average, only 20% of the time was spent in the framework. And it includes stuff about refinement and constraints I didn't even touch on here. A whole body of work in that. And then the final part is that I've shown that I've begun the development of the first platform-based design management, design manipulation, and computation framework for standard biological parts. It's Clotho now, developing the Mirai. Shown abstraction in parts, devices, and their concept. They have different views. Standardization support through the Clotho data model. And then also assembly support through the SDS algorithm and the design flow.
Great. Thank you.